Before we dive into the conflict of what's happening in the Middle East and how people can maybe change their perspective about it, that's kind of the whole goal of your organization, Kairos West Michigan. When did it come about, and what's the mission behind this group?
Okay, yeah, great. Kairos West Michigan is an organization that's affiliated with Kairos USA, which came out of the Kairos document, which is the Palestinian document, which is really about gaining equal rights for everybody in Israel-Palestine. We've been around for about 10 years or so, and Kairos USA about the same amount of time.
Mm-hmm. What exactly is why get involved in something like this? Why do you think you've been motivated to connect yourself with the conflict that's been going on there for decades, hundreds of years now?
Yeah, personal and philosophical. I have friends in the Middle East. I have friends in Israel, friends in Palestine, and they are living the reality right now, a reality that we're working to prevent, quite frankly. Philosophically, we're a Christian movement, and part of our sense of being Christian is to bring shalom, to bring the way God intended things to be on this world, in this world. And those that are involved in our organization see this as one way that we can help make things the way God intended them to be, which part of it for us is equal human rights for everybody, and in this particular case, in Israel-Palestine.
Mm-hmm. You were telling me you've lived in both Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, for about 2 years. Most of the time was on the Bethlehem side of the wall in Palestine, and with a few months on the Israeli side of the wall in a community called Beit Zefafa. We volunteered at a place called Bethlehem Bible College, and we worshiped at Christ Church in the Old City in Jerusalem.
When was this? How long ago was this?
2014, 2015.
Okay. I'm curious. I've been to Israel twice, and when you're there, you understand that there is constant battle between the two sides, but you don't necessarily always feel it. I'm wondering, from your own personal experience, did you kind of feel that same way, and did you ever expect that conflict to escalate to the point where it's currently at right now?
Yeah, great question. When we would go to Jerusalem on Sunday and worship, we would talk to our Israeli friends, and many of them, I would say most of them, had never been to the West Bank. And so for them, the reality of Palestinian life is maybe intellectual, mental assent to the way things were, and maybe things aren't the way they should be, but they didn't live it. Now, as Americans, my wife and I had no problem with either side. We could go back and forth without any difficulty, so we didn't feel the oppression or the difficulty that Palestinians live with. Our Palestinian friends definitely did, because they can't go across to the Jerusalem side unless they have a special permit, etc. And so, yes, from the Israeli side of things, it seems like the conflict is out there. One of the most horrific things that happened with the Hamas attack is that I don't think there's any Israeli that feels that anymore. I mean, every Israeli knows somebody who has been killed or taken captive, etc. So the reality of the situation is brought home way too clearly to Israelis today and in the last week. So yeah, it would be, in terms of did I expect something like this to happen? Frankly, I thought something like this would happen eventually, simply because when one people does not have equal human rights to another people, and the other people is perceived as the ones holding them back from equal human rights, you can only do that for so long. Violence erupts. That's not an excuse for violence, but it erupts, and I think that's what we saw unfortunately, tragically, 10 days ago.
I think when you have a conflict like this escalating to this degree, it becomes so polarizing, a lot of people are forced to feel like they need to choose sides. Should I support Palestine? Should I support Israel? But one of the things your organization aims to prove is that it doesn't necessarily have to be like that, and makes the distinction that just because someone might be pro-Palestine doesn't necessarily mean they're pro-Hamas.
Yeah, well said. The idea of Hamas representing all Palestinians is horrific to me. As far as in our opinion, Hamas does not represent Palestine. They do not speak for Palestinians.
And like you learned in person, the people living in Palestine would say the same thing, it sounds like.
In my experience,
some of them would, at least.
Most of the people in the West Bank are not in favor of any kind of terrorism, any kind of violence at all. And so there would be, they are as tragically involved with this situation as the Israelis are in different ways. Yeah.
What's a way that people can think about this a little differently? Well, first, what are some misconceptions about the way people might be viewing this conflict, and how do we think about it differently?
Yeah. Okay. So I think we often fall into dualistic thinking. It's either this or that, and there's no third way. And I think this is a prime example of that. And say, well, I choose your ugliness. Choose one ugly versus another ugly, and you have each side pointing out the ugliness of the other. Well, what if there was an organization who said, wait a minute, we can be for all Israelis living in peace and security and never have to worry about terrorism. We can be for Palestinians having equal human rights to everybody else in the region, and we can be against any violent act. In our opinion, violence only exacerbates the inequality. It only exacerbates, obviously, the feeling of insecurity. So that violence will never, does not, has not, will not bring a just peace to the region. So our organization would be more positively saying, we're for Israelis living in peace and security. What do we need to do for that to happen? We're for Palestinians to have equal human rights. What do we need to do for that to happen? We have some ideas about what that might be, but I think can we think about it a third way, so that we don't think always about taking one side versus the other, but saying, how can we address the legitimate interests of each side without having to take a position on A, B, and C? Just sit back and say, what do we need to do for Israelis to live in peace and security? What do we need to do for Palestinians to have equal human rights to Israelis in Israel and Palestine? And start there rather than starting at, I'm a Palestinian, you're an Israeli, what do we have to fight about? Let's look at how can we enhance each other's interest. That is not a perspective that you hear. I mean, you never hear that perspective. How can Israelis and Palestinians work together? We don't hear it. It's out there. An organization called Musalaha gets Israelis and Palestinians together, and they listen to each other's narratives. And they leave the meeting less sure about the truth that they came in with.
Why do you think it's so hard to have conversations like that? Not necessarily regarding just the people who live in the Middle East, but it seems like it's difficult to even have those conversations and find a common ground for people who are talking about the conflict here in America.
Yeah, we're under no illusions. This is a complex situation. And religion gets mixed up into it. The view, for example, very common in America, that Israel will have to be first and foremost in the Middle East before Jesus comes back, before Christ returns. That's a widely held view. So if you hold that view, you're going to be 100% for Israel, and you don't care about the details. All right, that's very unfortunately. It has also become a partisan issue in the United States, and so if you're a Republican, you are more likely to be all for Israel. If you're a Democrat, you're at least somewhat likely to say, wait a minute, unfortunately, that's a change in my view in the last 5 or 10 years or so, where we used to have a fairly strong bipartisan foreign policy, and now we have partisan infighting between some Democrats and basically all Republicans on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. That doesn't help. So all this is kind of a maelstrom of different perspectives that all get caught up in it. And if you're a Republican, you're going to be very much on the side of Israel, generally speaking. And if you're a Democrat, maybe not so much. So here we have this polarization in the United States. And this is another aspect of that polarization. There's religious differences, different perspectives on religion and what Israel has to do with Christ's return. All that gets mixed up, and before you know it, you have difficulty thinking clearly about it because all these other things are getting mixed up in the issue. One of the things we try to do is say, it's hard to argue about equal human rights for everybody. I mean, most people would say, yeah, I'm for that. That's an American value.
Yeah.
I'm
for us, it seems like a very fundamental goal to achieve.
Right. The difficulty that we struggle with here at Kairos, West Michigan, is we found that if you take a balanced approach to this situation, that because Israel has a lot of power and it's an economic powerhouse and a military powerhouse, it has the power. And so it's unequal for Palestinians right now. So if you have an organization that says, let's have equal human rights for everybody, that organization comes off as being pro-Palestinian. Now all of a sudden we get pushback from those people, two groups that I talked about. Hey, you're pro-Palestinian. Well, a little bit, because we're going to equal human rights for everybody. But we don't mean to be. We're just looking at a situation and says, my word, if we could make this situation the way God intended it to be, there would be equal human rights for everybody. And we wouldn't have the reason for violence or the reason for oppression, et cetera.
And for the other side, Israelis, I think, would argue the reason they've needed to put some things in place, like military camps along Gaza and in the West Bank, is to protect themselves from the violence that Hamas creates, which we're seeing unfold right before our eyes right now. I think, a lack of violence or hoping there can be peace and not achieve that through violence is easier said than done. Especially when you're dealing with a terrorist organization like Hamas. I think you share a similar viewpoint of a lot of people right now, that more hatred added to this conversation is not going to necessarily get us to the end goal where we want to be. However, I think some people would argue that what choice does Israel have right now? It's not like they all of a sudden stand down, and Hamas, being the unreasonable organization that they are going to stand down themselves too. They're just going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. So I'm just wondering if you feel, yes, we don't want violence, but at a certain point, like I just said, what choice does Israel have?
Right. Hamas cannot be seen as representative of the Palestinian people. Hamas needs to be eliminated as an influence. That's difficult. We're advocating a perspective that will be difficult to achieve. I would also ask this question, and your point is a good one. I'd ask this question: where have 50 to 75 years of violence and oppression, where has that led? What's going to happen after the siege of Gaza is over? If the basic reasons for the violence are not addressed. It may be a little while before it happens again, but in the 50 to 75 years, we've found out that violence has not brought, by either side, has brought about peace. Somebody's once said that insanity, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. And what we're seeing, I think, in Israel-Palestine is the insanity of trying something over and over and over again, expecting things to be different. Organizations like ours, Jewish Voice for Peace is another example. Churches for Middle East Peace, we're not alone in this. We're saying we have to stop this cycle. And we don't have all the answers as to how that is going to happen. But this perspective has to be out there, that what we're doing right now from both sides, violence, oppression, violence, that whole cycle, as long as that's continuing, we're not going to get any more. And 50 years from now, my grandson and your son is going to have the same conversation, and we don't want that to happen.
No. So in order to achieve equal human rights, other than doing it through an absence of violence, how do we achieve something like that?
So what is causing the lack of equal human rights right now? One thing is the settlements, for example. Settlements are basically what the United States did to our indigenous population. We took over. We moved in, we took over. Settler colonialism, taking over somebody else's land for your own people's purposes. All right, that is something that needs to be addressed. Again, don't have the. I mean, those settlements are what they call a fact on the ground. I doubt 750,000 Israelis are going to get up and move out. I doubt it. Okay, but so what do we do about that? What do we do about the occupation? In the land of Israel-Palestine today, roughly half, and if you took the total of all the people that live there, roughly half are Israelis and roughly half are Palestinians. How can one half of a population subjugate the other half of the population forever by occupation? In order for that to happen, there has to be some repressive measures being taken, which, of course, if you're the one being occupied, does not lift you up, lift your humanity up, it breaks you down. And so you get to the point of, well, we don't have the same equal human rights as Israelis do. And over time, that sort of situation leads to reaction in some way, shape, or form. And so it's that. So settler colonialism, the occupation, etc., and some of the policies that Israel implements even within the modern state of Israel itself tends to favor Israelis over Palestinians. You look at East Jerusalem, etc. They don't have the education, they don't have the medical facilities, they don't have the transportation, etc. that West Jerusalem has, etc. So those are the kinds of things. Again, if you look at and ask the question, what would it look like if everybody in Israel-Palestine had equal human rights, including the right to live in security, including the right to economic movement between their towns, etc. That would be on the road toward equal human rights for everybody. The concept of equal human rights for everybody. Again, I don't want to dismiss this question.
Yeah.
It's complicated. It's complex. Organizations like us, we don't have all the answers. All right, but we're putting a vision out there that we hope will be part of the conversation to move us closer to the goal of equal human rights for everybody, and that includes peace and security for all Israelis inside their borders.
What would you urge people watching this to do, or to maybe change their thought about what's happening in the Middle East? Because reactionary, I think a lot of Jews like myself are afraid to embrace our heritage right now for fear of our safety. And I think people who are pro-Palestine, anti-Hamas are afraid to express their views for fear of them being connected to the terrorist organization when they're not coming at it from that same viewpoint.
Right. Difficult for Americans to get a balanced viewpoint on the situation. It can be done. I would encourage everybody to question wherever you're at right now. Question which side you are in favor of, if you've chosen side. I'd question whether you've chosen to be pro-Palestinian or whether you've chosen to be pro-Israeli. If you've made that hard choice, I would suggest take a step back and start listening to voices from the other side and hear another perspective. Until we get to the point where we're listening to wise voices from each side, and there are many of them. By the way, Israelis are not uniformly anti-Palestinian, and Palestinians are not uniformly anti-Israeli. All right, so there's lots of different voices on the within the entire spectrum from both sides. A lot of those voices tend to get drowned out by, again, that dualistic narrative in our Western media that tends to ask you to choose your ugliness. Which side are you going to take? I would suggest take a step back, listen to the other side, listen to voices from the other side, and make your own decision without being unduly influenced by where you started in this conflict, or I'll say it, even your religious beliefs right now. Take a step back, listen to a Muslim's point of view. Listen to a Jew's point of view. And if you're a Jew or a Muslim, listen to a Christian point of view. Listen to an Al Jazeera point of view. All right? Listen to a different perspective, so that, not that they are going to represent complete truth, but by listening to all those different perspectives, I believe we get a clear voice of what is really going on. Don't assume you know what's going on because you've seen American media.
And you might have already answered this, but I just want to make sure I ask directly. What would you say is the biggest misconception about the conflict between Israel and Palestine, or Israel and Hamas right now in the Middle East? And is it that right there, the fact that a lot of people might think it is Israel versus Palestine, but maybe that's not it whatsoever?
Well, yeah, I think it is. You can characterize it as Israel versus Palestine.
Okay.
However, Israel versus Hamas is its own separate subset of Israel versus Palestine. Hamas is not Palestine, and so I think the biggest misconception has to do with all Israelis think one way, all Palestinians think the other way, and they all hate each other. I don't think that's the truth. I think there are again, the other misconception is that one side is right and the other side is wrong, and that it's black and white. I would think, again, I'd encourage people, look for the shades of gray. They're there. And again, one more time, ask yourself, what needs to be done for all Israelis to live in peace and security, and for all Palestinians to have equal rights to their Israelis across the border fence?
So anything else that you would like to add that completes the message, or anything we might have missed?
I think we covered it.
Yeah. Any?
My only thought is kind of like coming from a human nature side of this. I mean, it seems to me that it's very easy to feel the hurt and not feel forgiveness and feel the love for those that might have hurt you. And I'm wondering if that's part of why this has gone on for so long, is it's just been sort of a human nature thing that we haven't been able to overcome. Because your solution seems so elegant and simple, right? So why haven't we gotten there?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we haven't gotten there is because when we began, we started with violence and oppression. And then that cycle got started. And again, that's going to be a difficult cycle to stop. Full stop. Mm-hmm. It's going to be difficult to stop. However, doing the same thing over and over again, oppression and violence, is not going to work either. I mean, and so the idea that we will be able to wipe out violence by wiping out Hamas, I believe, is a misconception. We can wipe out Hamas, but unless we address the reasons for the hurt and the violence on both sides, we're going to be back in the same mm-hmm. position. So again, that's, like you mentioned, that's an easier thing to say mm-hmm. than it is to actually do. But we can't keep on doing what we've always done, because we're only going to get what we've always got. And what we see, what we always got, is what we have today. And yeah, I love the nation of Israel. I love the state of Israel. I love the people of Palestine. I love going there. I go there 2 or 3 times a year, some years. And so that's the personal side of this. I don't want my grandkids not being able to go to Israel and Palestine because of violence in Israel and Palestine. I want them to go and walk. I want that border fence to be gone. I want them to be able to walk back and forth, and I want them to walk in Palestinian neighborhoods and Israeli neighborhoods. And it's going to be a while before people are going to live together in harmony. Mm. But I'm hoping for a day when we can at least live in the same place together, with at least the assumption that we are all equal before God and before each other.
Mm-hmm. This is my last question. I've always found it so ironic. At the root of religion seems to be the golden rule: treat others the way you want to be treated. However, in the area of our world where it has the highest concentration of different religions coming together, we also have the highest concentration of violence. How is that possible?
Yeah, I think any your purest Muslim and your purest Jew and your purest Christian would say 100% correct. All right, mm-hmm. No matter who you follow as your religious leader, you don't have any argument with that. In my opinion, this is not a religious conflict. This is a social, economic, mm-hmm. ethnic conflict that is not all that different from other conflicts, like in Northern Ireland. The Protestants and Catholics weren't fighting each other because they were Catholic or Protestant. They were fighting each other for social and economic and ethnic reasons. Mm-hmm. Not even ethnic in that case. And so your question begs the answer, though. Even if it's not a religious conflict, how is it that people are not applying their religion? And I would say throughout history, our problem throughout history has not been that people didn't know what their religion teaches. Our problem is what? We don't follow what our mm-hmm. religion teaches. And historically, that's true for all of us. All religions.
Yeah, yeah. It's always been a big question at the front of my mind. I've never really fully understood why it is like that, but I think that's a good and interesting point, that even if we believe it, we don't always act in the way of our words.
Amen. Yeah.
I think we're good to end it there. Thank you so much. That was a really awesome conversation.
Great.
Yeah,
thank you.
I
appreciate the opportunity to